I'm delighted today to be joined by Lauren Kohr, Chief Risk Officer at Old Dominion National Bank. Lauren has engaged with the Royal United Services Institute events and panel discussions a few times. 2016 ACAMS Professional of the Year, 2019 ACAMS Excellence in Public-Private Partnership Award. So really delighted that Lauren's here to talk from a community bank perspective about some of the recent developments from FinCEN.
Thank you, Nick, for the opportunity. And before we get started, I just want to give the quick disclosure that the opinions that I give today are that of my own and not necessarily those of Old Dominion National Bank or any of the government initiatives that I've been a part of.
Very clear. So thank you so much for making the time. What we're talking about today is the FinCEN Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And some of the quite ambitious and very interesting proposed changes to how FinCEN will approach supervision and reflect desired outcomes within that process. What's your take on the proposals as a whole, and what are you most interested in?
I think as a whole, I'm most interested in the national priorities. I think that's going to be a really great opportunity for financial institutions of all sizes to really modernize their program and align them with the national priorities that are set by all law enforcement agencies within the U.S. I also think it'll be a great opportunity to really reevaluate our programs and shift from processes that may not be considered highly useful highly useful to law enforcement and put those resources towards the national priorities and really working through public-private partnerships with law enforcement.
And how do you see it working from a community bank perspective? What do you see the value of FinCEN stating these national priorities for financial crime or money laundering concern?
I see it as an opportunity for financial institutions or of all sizes, especially community banks, to really walk through their product, services, geography, and customer base and identify what are the true threats based off those priorities and really align their programs to that. And that's really where we're going to see the most benefit from these priorities.
And in the absence of these types of priorities, what do you do? How do you prioritize? And to what extent will you be able to prioritize resources, do you think?
As far as the priorities, where I see it is we're going to have the opportunity to go through almost like a risk assessment process is really what comes to mind, and identify what part of those priorities are applicable to our institution, and then align our monitoring programs to those priorities, as well as expand our public-private partnerships to those priorities. So if my priorities are really based on my products or services is, let's say hypothetically tax evasion, really working with the IRS through those public-private partnerships, or if it's FFIS, working, maybe with the FBI or the Secret Service. So really just kind of working through all of those priorities and identifying which is most valuable, or what are the threats to us, I guess you would say, based on our risks.
And is there a challenge, because of the sheer size and scale of the US market, for a federal institution to say, here are the priorities, here are the national priorities? Is there a challenge, that those won't translate well to the local environment, to the local risks? Do you see that as an issue?
I see probably the biggest challenge in this is two things: communication. So I think there's going to have to be a strong communication strategy between law enforcement, regulatory partners, as well as financial institutions. And two, really the suspicious activity monitoring programs that financial institutions use to identify, detect suspicious activity. And smaller financial institutions are going to need that ability to really align those programs to their actual risks within those specific priorities identified. And I think right now, it's a little bit, that ability to customize specifically to your risks aren't there. So I think as this evolves, maybe into an ANPRM and rolled out, that community banks really have that opportunity to align their programs specific to their applicable priorities. When I say applicable, I mean they're all applicable, and so is compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act. that will continue, but really aligning our programs to our true threats within each of those priorities.
And I think everyone who's been in charge of a budget can understand the importance of having priority objectives and in making investments towards that. There may be others in public discourse who perhaps feel that the items that aren't prioritized in a national set of priorities are important. And to some extent, national priorities might let financial institutions off the hook, if you like, for addressing some of these crime threats that didn't quite make the mark from FinCEN's perspective. Do you think that's a legitimate challenge?
I think what we have to remember is the bank secret, as we realign this, the Bank Secrecy Act is not going away. So we're still going to have to comply with all the rules and regulations out there. What this is offering is the opportunity for us to reevaluate processes that may not be considered highly useful information, that aren't directly, I guess you would say, in or tied to the actual Bank Secrecy Act, and really shift those resources to national priorities. So if I have some quality assurance or QC processes in place that maybe ultimately aren't resulting in highly useful information to law enforcement, or maybe built off what we call like a cottage industry, where it's not really regulatory required, but over the several decades, it's kind of just been a general practice. And I can take those resources, and if they're not true risks within my financial institution, I can reallocate them to, maybe a special investigations unit that's really working with law enforcement, and to a small community bank that may be just shifting one individual's 3 or 4 hours a week from focusing on a QC process and shifting them more towards now public-private partnerships, really working with law enforcement, understanding what our local threats are. So I think that in the end, we're not going to just let one section go to, or one component of the Bank Secrecy Act to go to focus on the other. We're still, in the end, we still have to comply with that regulation, but it's just really modernizing it so we become more nimble and ability to really move the needle to benefit law enforcement.
And finally, is there a, an issue here in terms of, for the supervisor, a challenge in, adapting to a new approach? Obviously, around the world, supervisors have been typically more focused on technical compliance issues, examination of technical compliance, rather than outcomes-based evaluations. What challenges or development do you see as necessary on the supervisor side?
Absolutely, and being involved in the the efforts within FinCEN to really, from the financial perspective, when they leveraged it, I think what's been great about this whole process is has every law enforcement agency rolled up their sleeves, been 100% involved in the development of this, so has all the regulatory bodies. And I think by having them have a seat at the table as well, they're really starting to see how this is going to evolve. And working through some of these challenges, but I think of communication and really shifting that way that we look at AML programs, and shifting it to what does an effective program look. It looks not only at technical compliance, but it also looks at the roots of the Bank Secrecy Act, which is how are you working with law enforcement? How are you providing them highly effective information, and really reestablishing what those components are. And I think that's really where we're going to get a lot of that information, is through some of those recommendations that individuals put in through the ANPRM for regulatory bodies to consider. But in the end, what's going to make that shift is that communication strategy that I spoke about, is just, everybody, as we roll this out, the regulatory partners, our financial institutions, and our law enforcement participants all have a clear expectation of what is useful, and then that's what we're being examined against.
I think it's fascinating. It's not perhaps a typical characteristic of large federal government agencies and apparatus being at the forefront of innovation and being agile in reforming regulation. But really in the US, I think this whole agenda could be driving a new approach to supervision around the world, one that is moving from not just technical compliance issues, but thinking about outcomes, going back to those principles about value to users and making sure resources are being well spent. It's very exciting to see. We'll look forward to seeing how it develops in the US. But thank you very much for giving us some of your time today, Lauren, to talk through the issues from your perspective.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lauren.